David Snyder. I'm the executive director of the First Amendment Coalition.
So, David, why don't you talk about why you think this case is important, why you're here today?
I'm here today because my organization has filed a motion to unseal the search warrant application in this case. The reason we think that's important is that it's of crucial importance to understand what the police department told the judge who issued these warrants. Was the judge aware that Bryan Carmody was a journalist, or was that withheld from the judge? Because clearly the California Shield Law applies here. This search warrant should never have been executed or issued in the first place. And so one of the mysteries here is, was the judge aware that Bryan Carmody is a journalist and thus subject to the Shield Law?
And this has gotten national attention. You think it's important for all journalists?
Absolutely. I think this warrant sent a truly chilling message for journalists all around the country, and specifically for journalists in the Bay Area. And this is a city that champions itself as a champion of civil rights, of First Amendment rights, and so to see city officers essentially breaking down the door of a journalist to figure out who his source is a really jarring and chilling thing to see. And so I think the attention that this has received has been well warranted. I'm a little surprised, frankly, that it hasn't received more national attention, because what happened was really exceptional.
Now, the San Francisco mayor, other politicians had initially defended this. Do you think they're going to change their position now that this has become a national issue?
I think we're seeing a very slow shift in the position of city officials. I think much too slow. I think the mayor still has not condemned the search warrant in the way that is warranted here. I'm glad to see city officials slowly coming around to see the truth here, but it's taken a really long time, and that too is really disturbing.
And the issue of protection of journalists, there's Julian Assange, there are many, many journalists around the world who not only have been threatened but killed. Is this a global issue?
It is a global issue. I think threats against journalists globally and in this country specifically have really increased in recent years, and I think part of that is due to the president's extremely harmful rhetoric.
They're scum?
The enemy of the American people. I think rhetoric like that really does have an effect. It is just words, but it's words of the President of the United States, so they have an inherent power that the words of anybody else do not. I think the hyper-partisan, sort of polarized political environment that we live in has fostered this. I think we're seeing that here in San Francisco.
Were you shocked by what happened to Bryan Carmody?
I was stunned. Mr. Carmody called me shortly after he was released from police custody, and I had to double check everything he said, because honestly, it was hard for me to believe that what he described had actually happened. When I determined that it had, I immediately connected him with a lawyer, who's Mr. Burke, who could handle this, because I was just bowled over that what he described appears to have actually taken place in the city of San Francisco.
Now, if they did violate the SHIELD Act in California, what should happen?
Well, the immediate remedy that Mr. Carmody is seeking is just to have his materials returned to him.
That's the case today?
That's the motion that Mr. Carmody brought, is to get his materials returned. The motion that my organization, the First Amendment Coalition, has brought, along with Reporters Committee and the Society of Professional Journalists, is to unseal the warrant materials to help understand where things went off the rails here. Whether Mr. Carmody has some later remedy by way of a civil rights lawsuit, I don't know, but I'm not a plaintiff's lawyer on the civil rights side. But I would say at a minimum, the facts appear to be pretty strong in his favor. What happened here was pretty outrageous.
And you're raising the question whether the judges were informed that he was a journalist.
Yes, I think it's important to know what the police told the judge, in part so that something can be done to prevent this kind of thing in the future.
That's pretty brazen, wouldn't it be, for the police to go to a judge to impound a journalist and not tell the judge he was a journalist?
Yeah, that would absolutely be brazen. On the other hand, I think there is an unfortunate unawareness or lack of awareness about California's shield law and how it applies and to whom it applies. So I don't automatically assume that anyone in the police department or even in the judiciary necessarily automatically understands the constitutional rights at stake here, but it should have been explained to the judge, and the judge should have, again, the warrant should never have issued. Just a matter of...
The judges might not have issued the warrant if they knew that he was a journalist.
They might not have, yeah. I mean, it's hard to speculate because we don't know what they knew, but hopefully we will soon know that, and so we will know where in the process this all went off the rails.
And what can the public do who are concerned about the protection of journalists, and what can they do?
For the public who are concerned about, well, support your local journalists, support local journalism outlets, support national journalism outlets, make it very clear to your elected representatives, whether in Congress or at City Hall, that the protection of journalists' rights is of crucial importance, not just for the journalists, but because what journalists do is so essential to the healthy functioning of any representative democracy. Journalists are really, in many ways, the eyes and ears of the public, and in many ways, the first line of enforcement for government, to make sure that government misconduct and corruption doesn't happen.
And the fact that he sells the material that he packages and he puts together a journalism report, including documents, and then sells it, that's what journalism is. You know, I have attorney-client privileges with my clients. It doesn't go away because I charge for my services. Let's go to the obvious one. Samuel Johnson, the 17th century English writer, said, "No one but a blockhead ever wrote except for money." This case is important not just for journalists, but for everybody, because if the police here can go after journalists to find out their confidential sources using a sledgehammer, if they can do it once, they're going to do it again and again. And what that means is the sources will dry up and information the public needs to know about what's happening in the shadows disappears.
Now, do you think the judges were informed about the fact that he was a journalist before they signed the warrant?
I can't say what they were told because it's in a sealed, but I can tell you in cases that I've done in the past, inevitably the police either diminish or just forget to tell the judge that they're searching a journalist's office or home. So we're going to see. One of the things that's going to happen today is we hope to unseal that and see what they say about him.
Now, at the police commission hearing, they said that they can't do it because there's an ongoing investigation.
Yeah, there's a technical legal term for that you can't put over the air, but it starts with B and S. There's an active criminal investigation by the police department into the police department itself to find out who leaked a report against a guy they didn't like. Yeah.
Are you surprised it's taken time for San Francisco politicians to challenge the validity of this raid on a journalist?
I think what we've got here is a really unfortunate mix of law and politics. The law is actually clear and simple. You cannot give a search warrant for journalist materials, period. That's simple. The politics are a mess. You've got the police department leaking something about their enemy, the public defender. The people like the public defender saying, well, we got to get to the bottom of this and supporting anything they can because they don't like the police department. So the police department's investigating itself, and it's going out and issuing a search warrant to try to get the source, which is actually in the police department. It's a circus, which is why I'm glad today we're in a court of law, not a circus.
And if it is the case that they did not inform the judge, the police department, that this was a journalist, thereby violating the SHIELD Act, what should be done?
Well, we're going for a triple header today. First, quash the subpoena, revoke it, bring it back. Second, return everything to Mr. Carmody and keep nothing. And third, unseal that search warrant. And once we see what was in that search warrant, what the police told, then the next step is Mr. Camody, I'm sure, has a very nice civil rights case against the San Francisco Police Department for violating his civil rights.
And the SHIELD Act, most people probably have not heard about it. What is it and when was it passed?
The SHIELD law was added to the California Constitution in the 1980s, and it's just like a doctor-patient or an attorney-client privilege. There's a privilege for journalists not to disclose confidential information such as who is their source.
And has it protected journalists?
It has protected journalists for many decades, well, until May 10th, when suddenly the San Francisco Police Department decided that the laws in the Constitution didn't apply to them.
They know the law?
We presume that they do, yes.
And if they don't?
I think it's really interesting in this case that the police department did not go through the district attorney's office to get this search warrant.
And District Attorney Gascon is saying that he did not approve of this?
He came out this morning, apparently yesterday, and said, indeed, this search warrant never should have issued, and he can't imagine a circumstance in which it should have.
What does that say?
That says that we need to have some grown-ups supervising the police department on this one.
Well, Mr. Carmody is free to pick up his property. We don't know if that means that they reviewed it. We don't know if it means that they copied it, but he's free to pick up his property. They gave us notice of that. They wanted to keep part of it, but they returned everything. They made it available as of 5 o'clock last night, and I'm told that it's available now through the court's representative.
Hey, Tom, what's the crux of your argument here?
Well, the crux of the argument is you should never issue search warrants to journalists and to newsrooms. It is appropriate only to issue subpoenas. That didn't happen here. They knew he was a journalist not only because he had a San Francisco press pass for the last 16 years and as a current one, but they also visited his home, San Francisco police did, a month before the search warrants were issued.
What is your understanding of the crime that they're alleging here? Because that's one of the questions that I've had for a while, is that this seems that it would be an administrative process for San Francisco police to determine how this report came out. What is your understanding of what the actual criminal investigation is here?
I have no understanding of what the investigation is, other than that the Board of Supervisors indicated that they needed to get to the bottom of what happened with the leak. Beyond that, I don't know.
They say they're investigating obstruction of justice, a possible obstruction of justice case. Does that make sense to you?
I will let them speak to that. It doesn't make any sense to me why you would issue a search warrant to a journalist, which is my focus.
Tom,
Were you surprised about the district attorney not being here?
Well, the district attorney told me a week ago, his office told me a week ago Sunday, that they were not involved in reviewing any of the warrants. So it didn't surprise me that he wasn't here.
Ms. Caroline, at the very end of the hearing, said something to the effect of, I'm going to be asking the city whether or not they release the warrant. Judge Feng said, I wouldn't hold your breath on that. What was the significance of that last exchange?
I think you should ask her that.
So, Tom, I wonder if you're frustrated at the pace that the judge has set for this. Did you expect something to be concluded today?
I think what's important is that the cities essentially acknowledge that they have improperly taken what they took. And it's back. We still have a lot of questions to answer, to be answered. The judges set the schedule that the judges set, and I respect that. Did you note that I got him on the record saying that he was a Los Angeles Dodgers fan?
Can you explain how you'll go about figuring out whether or not the police made copies and have retained copies of the property they're returning?
But we're certainly going to ask them that. If that's not something that's forthcoming, we'll go through other processes to do it. But at the moment, our indication is that they may have reviewed some of the materials, but it's just not clear.
You know, and Bryan Carmody yesterday was inferring that there's concerns with him being able to use the equipment ever again, that perhaps it's somehow tainted or damaged, that sort of thing. Is that a concern?
Well, I think it's a concern for a number of people as to whether or not he can continue to use the same equipment. I mean, mind you, because he doesn't want to have any malware or something else that might be on there, and I'm not suggesting that that's happened, but you have concern when you shouldn't have had your materials taken in the first place. You have concern about the condition that they're in when they are returned. It's not an easy task to pick up all of these. I mean, this is a substantial amount of equipment.
Why would the police department not want to release the warrants?
You'd have to ask them. I mean, if they were the basis for 2 searches on a journalist, you would think that they would want to have that story be told, because that's what the judges who issued the warrants were told.
You laid out your argument inside. If you could lay it out for us one more time. Is this a First Amendment case, a Fourth Amendment case, or is this California shield law, or some combination of both?
It's all of it. You cannot, reporters have due process rights. Mr. Carmody has rights as a journalist not to have the police come to his home with sledgehammers, seize his equipment, keep him detained for that entire time, then go to his office and end up taking essentially his newsroom. They confiscated his newsroom. All of you who do reporting have all kinds of stories on both your cell phones, you have leads, you have all kinds of things in your computers, your laptops, all of it. That was all gone.
You think there should be a criminal investigation of the police department for that action?
I will let the San Francisco police do what they will do.
Mr. Burke, can you please place the significance of this in the context politically of what's happening in Washington with attacks on the press, the importance of having this debate in San Francisco, in a city that's lauded for its progressive ideals to begin with?
Well, look, a search warrant should never be issued to a journalist, whether they're in San Francisco, which, is a very progressive place. It shouldn't be appropriate anywhere in the United States. I'm not going to comment beyond that. The focus here is on getting his material back and letting it be known that search warrants aren't the appropriate thing to do when you're trying to get information from a journalist.
What is a 1540? You mentioned the First Amendment, the SHIELD laws, and there's another I'm not entirely sure the number.
There's a penal code provision that talks about the return of information that's secured through a search warrant. And so during court, I quoted a portion of that penal code section which outlines when it's appropriate as a grounds to return it. And in this case, it's a violation of state or federal constitutional law.
Tom, is it your plan to pick up the gear today?
I will defer to Mr. Carmody about that.
And my question is that a victory for you that they are giving back the equipment?
Well, I think it's important when you have something like this happen that you get the material back as soon as you can. So sure, it is, but we want the search warrants revoked, and we want it made it clear that they shouldn't have been issued in the first place.
Mr. Burke, is there any indication to your knowledge that the police department used a special master in their search? The district attorney mentioned that this is standard practice in these sort of cases.
I have no information about a special master's involvement in this situation.
So if I heard correctly, it's been available for a little while. Did they not notify you?
No, there has been some discussions in the last few days about this, but they wanted to keep certain information, and we wanted to make it clear that even if we took everything back, even if they gave everything back, that we still had to go through this legal process to ensure that search warrants aren't issued and that these were revoked.
Do you know if they're done with it? Like they've made images of some of the materials and searched the phone and they're simply through with their search? Or do you think
I
this
have
is
no
some
idea.
kind of attempt to say, okay, maybe we were wrong here in this and we want to give the property back?
I don't know one way or the other.
Do we know the names of the judges who issued the warrants?
Yeah, that's been reported.
Do you think there's anything in the warrant, if it is actually unsealed, that would justify this entire process?
I don't think anything could justify a search warrant under these facts. The two key facts are he has a San Francisco press pass, which all of you, it's hard to get. He's had one for 16 years. It's current. Number two, so that they're on notice that he's a member of the press. And number two, he is asked at his home by San Francisco police, the same officers involved in getting the search warrants, if he will reveal his confidential source. They press him for it. He refuses to give that. And when he refuses to give that, they threaten him with a federal grand jury subpoena. Now, how they can make that threat, I don't know, but they threatened that, and then they left. And then a month later, they come back with the search warrants. Under those circumstances, anything that they would be looking for would necessarily be information that's protected by the SHIELD law, namely his confidential source.
To confirm, the motions that were going to be heard today are going to be heard on the 10th, no? Both motions?
They're going to be set either on the 10th, meaning they will be set for a later date after that, and the court may set them for a hearing earlier than that.
Could the judge have ruled against the police department here today?
You'd have to ask the judge.
Legally, they could have ruled to quash or
The
to.
city filed no opposition. The police department filed no opposition to the paperwork that we filed last week. The court obviously is concerned about addressing all of the various issues that are involved in a situation like this. And so I think the court asked for more time in order to allow the city to have an opposition and allow there to be a reply and to have a later hearing on it.
Are you concerned that they could process evidence in a way that might lead to the source, even though they return the actual material as something that they might find there And then you could have the material back, but it doesn't matter. He's given it back. They've given it back to you, but they've used it to find out who the source is.
Well, we're obviously very concerned about that. That's why Friday evening, while the entire Bay Area was watching the Warriors play Houston, I was trying to reach the police department and the district attorney's office to say, don't look at this. That's the work that was done immediately. So they've been on notice since a few hours after the search not to review it. Now, if they chose to review it, I think there will be consequences. I don't know one way or the other whether or not they reviewed it. It's good that we're getting it back, but it's critical to know what, if anything, that they kept copies of, what, if anything, they are doing with the information that was, in our view, improperly seized from his newsroom.
They could have gone through that entire process and not reviewed the material. You think that's a possibility?
I don't know. That is a possibility, however.
But the court can't order them not to do that. Is that what you're seeking? I'm trying to figure out now.
No, the court could basically say that the search warrants were not appropriate to have been issued, and that they need to return everything that they have, and that they can't use anything that was received as a result of the seizures that were taken through those search warrants.
For any purpose, as opposed to just for a criminal?
For any purposes.
But one of the things they might be able to use it for example, is an internal investigation to try to find out who the officer is that way.
I think for any purposes, we want that material back and not available to them. There is a proper way in which to get information from a journalist. You're all journalists here. You'll receive a subpoena. It'll be narrow. It's like a sniper shot, as opposed to a search warrant, which is a net. It grabs everything. It grabs everything you've ever worked on. That's never appropriate. It's not appropriate in San Francisco. It's not appropriate anywhere in the country.
And if we could just talk about what today means in a broader sense. Is this a victory for Mr. Burke? Is this a loss for the San Francisco Police Department? How does it balance out?
The judge essentially deferred deciding on both of the motions. So my organization filed the motion to unseal the search warrant application, and we were hopeful and asked that the judge decide that motion today and make the application materials public. The judge decided not to do that, but rather set a briefing schedule. We respect that the judge did that. However, I do think he had the ability to decide today, and I think the public has a right to see the materials that the police department submitted in support of the search warrant, because those materials will help explain whether the judges who issued the search warrant understood that the search was to take place at the home and office of a journalist, and thus whether the shield law should apply. Will help unravel the mystery of what went off the rails here that allowed these search warrants to issue and for Mr. Carmody's home and office to be searched in this extremely overbroad manner.
Do you think there's anything that could be in that warrant that would justify that dragnet search at all?
Not that I can think of. Based on the facts that we know now, and based on what we know about California law, I don't see that a search such as the one that was conducted on Mr. Carmody's home and office could be justified.
What's the name of your organization, sir?
First Amendment Coalition. We filed a motion to unseal.
What's at stake here?
Well, at the most immediate level, Mr. Carmody's ability to continue his work as a journalist. On a broader level, I think what is at stake here is the ability of the Fourth Estate to conduct its business, to conduct its constitutionally protected mission, which is essential to the healthy functioning of a democracy. When the state acts in a manner that's this abusive, and that is this intrusive on journalists' rights, it sends a message, I think, to all journalists that they need to be on guard to this kind of abusive and over-intrusive search of journalist materials.
And we're talking about more than Mr. Carmody here. It's a broader. There's a broader issue here, which is, and we talked about this before, that the public is the one that winds up getting hurt out of all this. I think you can lose the forest for the trees and see that this is just a case about Mr. Carmody having his home searched. But your argument is that it's a broader impact on society at large.
Absolutely. What journalists do, I think, first and foremost, is be the eyes and ears of the public, and also they perform an essential watchdog function on our government entities. And so when the core mission of journalism is threatened in the way that I think it has been here, I think the entire public suffers. The public is the ultimate beneficiary of journalists' work to expose wrongdoing and corruption. And when journalists are subjected to this kind of overextensive use of force and legal process, I think the whole project of journalism is threatened, and thereby the public's ability to benefit from journalism.
Why would the judge not rule on that? I mean, he thinks that you should basically go on and on with briefs, and this isn't an emergency situation.
I can't speak for the judge. I think he indicated that he wants to hear from both sides as fully as possible, and I understand and respect that. I do think that the judge could have ruled today, and we were optimistic that he would. As to the issue that is before the court on my organization's motion, whether the records should be unsealed, we believe they should already have been unsealed.
Maybe it's a national security issue.
Well, we think the records should already be public and that it shouldn't have required a motion to unseal. The other side filed no opposition to our motion, and so we were optimistic that the public would be able to see these search warrant applications today. That's obviously not going to happen, which is really unfortunate. I think delayed access in many ways is denied access, and so the public is apparently going to have to wait for at least another several weeks to understand what happened here that allowed the process to go off the rails, such that a journalist's home and office, essentially his newsroom, were subjected to this dragnet sort of search.
And District Attorney Gascon was not here. None of his representatives was here. Why wouldn't they be here?
I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I mean, I think it would have been the city attorney, I think, that might have showed up on behalf. I don't think the DA was involved in the search warrant.
Are you concerned that this is a conduit, this is a crime that didn't really occur in the sense that it just basically just finding out who his sources are? So it's really an attack not just on him but on the source, right? I mean, that he could or she could be in administrative problems over this even if the whole search warrant got tossed.
Well, one of the mysteries here is what the underlying crime was. It's not a crime to release a police report from the police department. It may be a violation of departmental policy, but the California Public Records Act makes clear that departments may release police reports if they choose to do so. So one question I've had since I first heard about this on the day that Mr. Carmody's house was searched was, what's the underlying criminal conduct? And that's one of the questions that I think the search warrant application could help reveal.
If it is revealed, Mr. Snyder, what's next? What do you do with that information?
Well, I think the public has to first understand where the system went afoul and what entities or individuals were to blame for allowing the system to go awry as it did. One of the most important things I think that can ultimately happen here is for public officials in San Francisco specifically, but also much more broadly, to understand what the journalist shield law in California is and how important it is. Whether the judge just wasn't aware of it, whether the judge wasn't aware that Carmody is a journalist, we don't know. But I think with public exposure of what the judge knew and didn't know, hopefully we'll come to a point where there's a greater understanding and some accountability for this overreach here.
I think it was a conscious decision for the attorney representing SFPD to not file any opposition.
I don't know. You'd have to ask them. They had the opportunity to file some papers, and they chose not to do so. I don't think we were aware that anyone was even going to appear today on behalf of the city, and so they did, and now they have the opportunity to brief the matter. I think I'll leave it at that.
Delay. The San Francisco Police Department is clearly scrambling to figure out and try to get their act together on what they're going to do about this. The DA has already said what they did was wrong. The First Amendment groups have said what they did was wrong. The politicians are lining up and said what they did was wrong. So they are heading for cover and trying to figure out how to cover themselves, shall we say.